Hello and welcome to the Boston University Pardee Center seminar on the costs of war with Dr. Heidi Peltier. My name is Stephanie Savell. I'm the co-director of the Cost of War Project. It's a project based at Brown University's Watson Institute and Boston University's Pardee Center, looking at the many costs of the United States' choice to continue a war on terror, so-called war on terror, the post 9/11 wars since the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. We are well known for our research on the budgetary costs of war. The post 9/11 wars we've calculated have cost $6.4 trillion. And the human costs, the death toll of the post 9/11 wars, direct death toll is over 800,000 people, and indirect many times as many people have died through the collapse of infrastructure and all the many other ripple effects of war in the war zones of Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere around the world. Today, Dr. Peltier, who is a research fellow at the Pardee Center and the director of the 20 Years of War series, will be giving a talk. The 20 Years of War series at the Cost of War Project is a series of papers leading up to the 20-year mark in October 2021 of the beginning of the post 9/11 wars. And we're really trying to take a comprehensive look at the human, budgetary, social, political costs and consequences of these wars. So Dr. Peltier is going to be presenting her research on the Pentagon's over-reliance on military contractors as a cost of war. And I just wanted to introduce her talk today by highlighting her research was covered in June 30th, 2020 issue of the Washington Post. The headline read, "Use of military contractors shrouds true costs of war. Washington wants it that way, study says." That's the headline. And while Dr. Peltier's talk today will focus on the economics of the Pentagon's over-reliance on contractors and how this drives costs up, I wanted to really highlight first how her work showcases the devastating human toll of the over-reliance on military contractors. And that's what the Washington Post article started with. It's a story of human suffering that's largely hidden from the view of the American public. So the story starts out this way. The rockets that fell on a military base in Iraq did not distinguish between soldiers and contractors. Nawaz Hamid, a US contractor working as an interpreter, was killed in the December 27th attack by an Iranian-backed militia that also injured American troops, prompting retaliatory strikes that edged the United States and Iran closer to open conflict. Hamid's death illuminated the proliferation of contractors at US bases worldwide over the past 2 decades, a presence that camouflages the true cost of war, according to a study on the commercialization of the US war effort. So about 53,000 US contractors were in the Middle East last year, compared with 35,000 US troops. So the number of contractors far exceeds the number of US troops. And just to highlight a couple of ways that this camouflages the true human costs of these wars, many of the contractors killed are foreign nationals from places like Nepal and Colombia. And so Dr. Peltier emphasized in the Washington Post that this has led to a double exploitation of using foreign workers for dangerous jobs and paying them less than US employees earn. We have another paper on our site by Noah Coburn that looks at how the foreign nationals, as they're called, that are working for these military contracting companies in the war zones face all kinds of human rights abuses in their positions. And a lot of them are kind of, almost trafficked and then stuck in the places where they're working. And then there's also a concern that the reliance on military contractors has blunted the American public's understanding of the human cost, in the sense that, as someone was quoted in the article, you don't see yellow ribbons around trees for contractors. So there's a sense in which, that this reliance on contractors blunts the public's understanding of the fact that there are people who are actually dying in these wars, because it reduces the total count of American troops who are dying. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Peltier, and I will open the floor to questions after her talk. So thanks
so much, Stephanie. So let me just take a second to share my screen here. Okay, so today's talk is called The Camo Economy, the Economic and Political Camouflage of Military Contracting. And it's based, as Stephanie mentioned, and first I'd like to just extend my thanks to Stephanie Savell for moderating today, and to John Prendato and the Pardee Center for hosting this webinar. So the talk that I'm giving is mainly based on a paper that came out on June 30th of this year called The Growth of the Camo Economy and the Commercialization of the Post 9/11 Wars. And the slides that we'll be seeing today will be available to anybody who wants to access them, and there are links to the papers and resources that I'll present in the slides. So to give a little bit of background into the question of why I wanted to study this. One was just a recognition that spending on federal contractors has been increasing in recent decades. This has been a question that I've had interest in studying for a while, but one of the aspects of the camouflage of military contracting is it's very difficult to get good financial data and employment data on contractors because they're private entities. So there's not a lot of publicly available data. And so that makes research a little bit complicated on this issue. I'll note that I use the term commercialize rather than privatize because military contractors aren't really private entities. They use public dollars, tax dollars. They serve a public purpose. They're at least ostensibly subject to public oversight. And so calling them private companies doesn't seem very accurate in my mind. So I prefer to use the term commercial firms or commercialization rather than privatization. The profitability is a second point that kind of got me interested in this question, is the profitability of commercial defense spending and the intersection between that profitability and the incentive to stay at war, and how commercial firms that are profiting from war would have a different incentive to stay at war as opposed to the public entity who might have other incentives to want to stay at war, but would have more of an incentive to retreat from war rather than to continue staying there for the sake of profit. And then a lot of what the paper will talk about, or does talk about, is the negative implications of contracting on the federal budget, both now and in the future. And the negative implications for labor markets. So what I call labor market distortion, because military contractors offer higher than average wages for many types of occupations. And that distorts people's choices of which market to go into, which type of firm to go into. So engineers considering their future and the demand for certain positions and the pay might be attracted to a firm like Lockheed as opposed to a renewable energy company or some other company or position that might have a greater public purpose. So these are sort of the motivating questions. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the DoD contract spending, and the data behind this slide come from usaspending.gov, which is a public, freely available resource. And what we see is that contracting has increased 164% since 2001. So we start in 2001 with about $140 billion of contracts through DoD. And this is all Department of Defense, not just war related, but all Department of Defense contracts. We start with 140 billion in 2001. It rises to a peak of 380 billion during the troop surge in 2008, and it comes back down and then has gone back up again in the past few years. And I looked last week at the most recent data. If we added 2020 in there, it's at about 377 billion. So basically right up at the peak, if we included the one more bar of data. And if you look at how contracting has changed, it's not just a matter of the increase, but also the type of contracting. So this graph was produced by the Defense Business Board. The graph cuts off at 2016, so a little bit shorter timeline than what we saw in the previous graph that I compiled. But what you can see is that the top kind of dark purple section is weapon systems procurement and other types of military expenses like housing and construction. And this is the tranche that is maybe what we generally think of as contracting, or what historically has been the contracting firms have been in weapon system procurement, ammunition, clothing, a lot of manufacturing. But what we've seen since 2001 is a real increase in contracted services. So if you look in the middle of the graph, that pink slice, from 2001 until 2016, there's been a real increase in contracted services, especially in war theaters. And looking just at the contracts that DoD has with the place of performance in Afghanistan, 62% of those are for services. And these services can be anything from dining services, telecommunications, car rental, fuel supply, and in many cases, services that used to be provided by the military itself, including things like dining services, fuel convoys, and armed guard services and other protective services that are increasingly being replaced, or troops are being replaced by contractors. Meanwhile, on the bottom of the graph, civilian personnel and military personnel, you can see, have also risen, but more slowly than the services and procurement have risen. So I want to talk about three different sets of drivers, three reasons why contracting has increased over the past few decades. And these aren't completely distinct. There's overlap between these three categories, but essentially we have ideological, political, and economic drivers. So the ideological driver is this promise of cost savings and efficiency through market competition. So this is the idea of privatization that really starts getting pushed in the 70s and 80s that, well, I'll come back to this in a second because I want to just introduce these three and then I'll talk through each one a little bit more in detail. So the ideological promise of cost savings and efficiency, the political driver, which is the political savings of using contractors and reducing troops. So we don't know how many people go to war. We don't know how many people come home injured or dead. The economic driver is the third category. And that's basically the sense that after the Cold War, there was this drawdown that left extra resources, people, manufacturing capacity, firms looking for profits, and they needed some place to go to create new markets. So the ideological driver, this idea that privatization is more efficient and would save tax dollars. I have a couple quotes here. One is not exactly a quote, but one is from the OMB circular, the Office of Management and Budget circular in 1983, that focuses on a push to commercialize where possible for the sake of efficiencies and cost savings, except for what they call inherently governmental activities. And I'll mention that the line between what is inherently governmental and not inherently governmental has gotten increasingly blurred, especially as contracting has gotten more into services and troop replacement. There's some real questions about what is inherently governmental and what isn't. And then on the bottom of the slide, this is a snippet from a backgrounder produced by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank that came out in 1986 called How to Privatize Federal Services by Contracting Out. And I'll read the quote: "To accelerate contracting out, the administration should change the procedure for awarding contracts so that the bias against private firms is removed. In addition, Congress should overhaul drastically the impediments that it has erected to contracting out. By working together to improve the process, significant reductions in spending could be achieved without reducing services to the American people. So this is the drive, what some would call the neoliberalism push toward privatization. The idea that government is a monopoly and therefore is inefficient and has no incentive to reduce costs, and that private firms that are facing market competition will then be more cost effective, more cost efficient, and produce higher quality goods and services. And as we'll see, that there are various reasons why this doesn't come true for military contracting in particular. The second set of drivers is the political driver of using contractors and reducing troops. So this is one of the reasons I call the military contracting the camo economy, because it really camouflages not only the finances of what we spend on war and the military in general, but also the human impact. How many people go to war? How many people are injured? How many people are dead? There's much more public recognition of troop deaths than of contractor deaths. And there's much more public recognition of troops going to fight in wars than there is of contractors going to fight or going to serve in the theater of war, doing things that in the past troops would have done. So the Cost of War Project put out some research by Nita Crawford and Catherine Lutz looking at the human toll of the wars. And Stephanie mentioned this in the introduction. This is part of the 800,000 plus direct deaths that have occurred worldwide in the post 9/11 wars. Of those, only a very small percentage have been US deaths. But what we see is that there are more contractor deaths than troop deaths. And there's not much public recognition about this. So about 8,000 US contractors have died compared to 7,000 US troops. And if we just look at the presence overseas, the ratio of contractors to troops has really been increasing over time. And so historically, there are always fewer contractors than troops. And that ratio has shifted so that in the post 9/11 era, it's consistently more contractors than troops now. And as of last year, the ratio was about 1.5 to 1. There were about 53,000 contractors in the Middle East compared to 35,000 troops. And that ratio is increasing because what we're seeing lately is that as there has been some drawdown of troops, the drawdown of contractors is not matching that drawdown. So it's a slower drawdown of contractors. And so publicly, what we hear is troops are coming home from the Middle East, but what we don't hear is they're being replaced or supplemented by contractors, so that the withdrawal is actually much more minimal than it appears publicly. And then the third set of drivers is the economic drivers, and that's based on what's sometimes referred to as Say's law, that supply creates its own demand, that you have people with expertise, you have companies that are seeking profit, you have excess capacity, and they're looking for a new market. And once the Cold War was over, what we see is what I call kind of two categories of market creating activities. So the market opportunists are what I call these kind of entrepreneurial firms that create private security companies or private military firms, PSCs or PMFs, that basically offer armed services, arms protective services, and other types of services in theaters of war. So one example here would be Blackwater. And then the other set I call the market makers, and these are bigger, more established, politically connected firms that basically find a new way to create a market for themselves. So one example is Kellogg Brown and Root. This company has gone through many versions of name and ownership. It was Brown and Root, Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR. But essentially what happened here was that Brown and Root got a contract to study the most effective way to provide for different types of military contingencies. And their conclusion was to have a mega contractor provide various types of services in war theaters. And then they themselves got this first mega contract. And in in the era since 2001 until 2019, KBR has gotten more than $50 billion of contracts in the Middle East. So the promise, the ideological promise, was that military contracting in general would be a way to save money. But what I show in the paper is that, in fact, the opposite is true. And there are a number of reasons why military contracting doesn't save money and actually turns out to be more expensive in many cases than providing the same goods and services in-house. And so I'll talk about two kind of broad groupings of why military contracting is so expensive. And the first group has to do with the nature of contracts. And what we find is that military contractors act more as commercial monopolies than as privately competitive firms. So they don't, in many cases, face the cost-reducing competitive pressures that would make them more cost efficient than the public sector. And if we look at the nature of contracts, first, one thing about contracts is they can be either cost type contracts or fixed price contracts. So in a fixed price contract, your contractor comes to your home and gives you an estimate of what they think the work will be, and you pay them that estimate no matter whether there's a cost overrun or not. It's the contractor who bears the cost overrun. If their estimate is bad, then they bear that risk. With a cost type contract, the contractor doesn't bear any of the risk of the excessive cost. Those go all to the buyer. So in the case of cost type contracts with DoD, the contractor is reimbursed for all reasonable cost plus a profit on top of that. And so there's no incentive no incentive for the contractor to reduce costs in that case, because they know the cost will be paid by the government, by the taxpayer. In the past decade or so, about 30% of DoD contracts were cost type contracts. So 30%, billions of dollars not subject to cost reducing pressures. And then secondly, there are non-competitive contracts. So contracts, and you can see this in the USA Spending Database, contracts can either be labeled competitive or non-competitive, and they can be non-competitive for various reasons. And one is that there's only one sole source, there's only one potential supplier. And then another reason they can be labeled non-competitive is if it's for national security reasons. So what we see is there is a much larger percentage in DoD of non-competitive contracts than there is in other agencies and other departments. And 45% of DoD contracts last year were non-competitive contracts. Then second point here is that another thing that has happened in recent years is we have more contracts that are considered lifetime contracts or sole supplier contracts. So this is really explicit monopoly creation where, for example, Lockheed Martin produces the F-35, and along with the sales contract for the F-35 is a lifetime agreement that Lockheed Martin will service that F-35. So they lock in a lifetime monopoly on a service that goes along with some sale of a bill of goods. And likewise, sole supplier contracts where, for example, there are purchase agreements or contracts for the provision of a weapon system, and then a sole supplier contract for all the replacement parts. So again, a way to create monopoly. And then last, we get just what I call de facto monopolies. And that is when you have firms providing services overseas in the theater of war, where the contract might be technically competitive and they could be replaced, but for various reasons, the sunk cost, the difficulty of replacing contractors in the middle of war, the relationships that develop between troops and contractors overseas, even though they're technically competitive, they don't get recompeted. And then the second category that I'll come to for why military contracting is so expensive comes, basically we can group into waste, fraud, abuse, and excessive profits. And there's lots of documentation on this. A year ago, the Washington Post came out with the Afghanistan papers that showed, a lack of oversight, too many dollars going out too quickly, often getting into the wrong hands. So in the Washington Post Afghanistan papers, you see that sometimes money was getting into the hands of insurgents because there was not good oversight as contracts were going out, and then sometimes subcontracted and further subcontracted, making it really difficult to see who is actually getting the tax dollars for war expenses. Another example is overbilling or billings for services never performed. And so there are various lawsuits documenting things like this. One example is with KBR, they were found to bill for a certain period of time 136 meals for every 100 meals that they served. Various documented cases of bribes and corruptions, which you see by the inspectors general. So the SIGAR and SIGIR report, those are the inspector general reports in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then just the issue of profitability. There's an intersection, obviously, between profitability and political influence. So Lockheed Martin, for example, and I pick on Lockheed a bit, but I think it's fair game to pick on them because they get about 10% of all military contract dollars, and they earn about 85% of their revenues through government contracting. And they spend on average in recent years about $13 million a year on political lobbying. Since 2001, their annual profit levels have been in the $4 to $8 billion range. And again, most of this is from government contracts. And I'll show a slide on that in just a second. But before I do that, one last point is that the layers of contracting also build in layers of profit. And so when you have profit-driven companies and cost-type contracts, these things intersect such that you have a prime contractor who subcontracts and further subcontracts and further subcontracts, and each contractor builds in their own profit. So by the time the bill gets back to the U.S. government, they're paying 3-4 slices of profit for different contractors along the way. So the cost is much higher in that case than what it would be in-house. And so this is just to look at military contracting and profits. The orange bars, and I'll note that there are two different axes here. The orange bars are along the left-hand axis. That's representing military contracts, all DoD contracts. And then the blue line is on the right-hand axis. That's Lockheed Martin profits. And so what you can see is the trend for Lockheed Martin's profits very much in line with military contract dollars overall, and in recent years, increasing even faster than the increase in contracts. So to get to budgetary issues, so contract spending in 2019 was more than half of all discretionary spending, 370 billion out of 676 billion, and about half of total defense spending. And I'll take a second to point out that about half of all DoD spending is contract spending, and about half of the whole federal budget goes to the DoD. So what this means, and I didn't make this connection clear enough in my paper, and I don't have it as a bullet point here, but I want to mention a quarter of all federal spending goes to military contractors. Half of federal spending goes to DoD, half of DoD goes to contractors, so a quarter of all federal spending goes to military contractors. So this can lead to the increased cost of using contractors can lead to pressure to reduce non-military spending now. So if there's pressure to reduce debts, the debt and deficits, that means to keep military spending high, we have to cut non-military spending. The other alternative is to grow deficits and debt, and then the interest payments that are due on that debt. And a paper came out that I wrote with the Cost of War Project earlier this year, I think it was January, looking at the cost of debt related to the wars, the post 9/11 wars. And we've spent at about $1 trillion just paying interest on the debt that we've taken out on those wars. So the more we continue to spend on war, the more we continue to overspend on contractors, the greater the debt and the interest payments on those debt grow. And so that reduces future opportunities to spend on non-defense or even on defense, but it reduces future opportunities to spend on non-defense, non-interest payments. And this also shifts the burden of payments to future generations. And that also reduces, this is another part of the camouflage, is it reduces political pressure to end wars now. When we don't feel the pinch of paying for war because we're paying it through debt, and that the repayment of the debt is being pushed off into the future, that reduces any kind of public acknowledgement of the cost of the war and public pressure to reduce war and military spending. I'll go kind of quickly through the labor issues because I know we're starting to run a little bit short on time and I want to have enough time for Q&A. But military contracting through this, the profitability distorts labor markets. So there are a couple ways that this happens, and I just want to talk about a few ways that labor demand is affected. So as the profitability of war leads contractors to kind of push for continued war then keeps the demand up for contractors. So this relates to the kind of economic driver of contracting. So there's demand for contractors, demand for the types of occupations that contractors need. And you can look at that in comparison to demand for other industries that might be publicly important or that might serve a public purpose, like clean energy industries, education, healthcare, and so on. Also, this point was made by P.W. Singer in his book on contracting, that contractors have lower input costs because essentially the public has borne the cost of training and recruiting. So when you have contractors that are hiring ex-service members or even sometimes poaching directly from the military, those soldiers or ex-soldiers have been trained and recruited, and then the contractors themselves don't have to do the training and recruiting. A third point, the creation of one-stop shop contracts where, as I mentioned earlier, the contractor produces the weapon system, but then has an ongoing service agreement. This requires ongoing labor and again, keeps the demand for military-related positions high. And in general, the militarization of the budget just creates more demand for military related positions as opposed to non-defense positions. And on the supply side, since profitable contractors can offer higher salaries than other types, higher salaries than the military itself and higher salaries than other types of firms in the economy, an ex-soldier or a soldier who's currently in the armed services would find working for a contractor more attractive than their other options. And in some cases, and this is fairly well documented, that some soldiers have difficulty transitioning to civilian employment and sort of miss the thrill of being at war, and having private security firms like Blackwater and others like that has some appeal for them to look for that type of position as opposed to something else. And there are, I won't get into this today, but there is a lot of overlap between certain types of occupations in the military and certain types of occupations in particularly in infrastructure and clean energy. And I'll just say something quickly about the compensation and what we might think of as the wage premium. So here is some data that was compiled by a website called pesa.com, and this shows compensation information for KBR. And so on average, KBR salaries are around $104,000. If you look at electricians in particular, they earn on average 87,000 at a firm like KBR. The national average for electricians, if you look at all firms and public sector, is about 55,000. So KBR can offer a 58% wage premium. If you look at security occupations, and this is, one of the set of occupations that that veterans tend to go into. If you look at security guards or police and detective, security guards nationally earn about 28,000 and change. Police and detectives on average about 63,000. Meanwhile, working for KBR in security, you could earn 76,000 per year. So that's a 20% to 166% wage premium. And here's the same sort of data for Lockheed Martin. Their engineers earn on average 125,000 compared to a national average of 87,000 for engineers. So 43,000% wage premium. So if you're a MIT or BU engineer about to graduate and you're thinking, which sector should I work in? There's a real pull and a real distortion to the labor market when military contractors can offer these high wages, which they're able to do because of the excessive profits that they earn through military contracting, through their essentially monopoly arrangements with DoD, and through the high profit levels they're able to achieve. So the takeaways, we spend currently $380 billion a year on contractors, which is more than half of all defense discretionary spending. Contracting has increased 164%, so more than doubled since 2001. That many contractors operate more as commercial monopolies than as private competitive firms. That because of monopoly structure and contract types, many contractors have little to no incentive to reduce costs. And that waste, fraud, abuse, and excessive profit also raise the overall cost of military contracting. So this has implications for the federal budget. It has implications for labor market. And there are various ways to reduce and reform contracting and to reduce the expense of contracting. And I'll make the final point that military spending can and should be reduced overall, not only by withdrawing from the post 9/11 wars, but also with less money flowing to the Camo economy. And I'll end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heidi. That was so interesting to hear you flesh out some of the things that you've written about in your work. So with that, I will open it up to questions from our audience. The first question is around whistleblowers. Given the dangers that contractors face, I'm not sure what's meant by that, are there any whistleblowers?
My guess is this question has to do mainly with the contractors that would be overseas. So all kinds of contractors doing dining services and fuel supply and all of that. And I imagine there would have to be some whistleblowers. I don't know, offhand of any particular examples, but what we do see is these Inspector General reports in Afghanistan and in Iraq in particular, where no doubt there are whistleblowers that work with the inspector generals to kind of flush out some of the activity that there are, many documented instances of a military service member taking a bribe in order to give out a contract to somebody in that area. So I don't know. I haven't read anything specific to the whistleblowers, but I imagine that's where that sort of activity would come up.
Mm-hmm. Relatedly, one of the things that struck me was, the story that one hears, if one hears much in the public discourse about these contracting companies, are stories about waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Like the $7,000 toilet or whatever. But what strikes me in particular about your paper is that you have that in there, but you're also talking about like the basic kind of market reasons why these firms are more expensive than having these services in-house. And I wonder if you do have any particular kind of stories or examples, of things like, you mentioned like the relationships that are built in the war zones that mean that these companies are essentially sole suppliers and things like that, just to kind of bring that part of your data to life a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the ways this shows up, and there's some good journalism on this, and as you say, my paper goes more into the structural issues than into the kind of detailed stories. And so what I want to show, what I try to show by bringing out these structural issues, is that it's not a case of one particular bad contractor or a particular set of corrupt individuals. That there's a systemic problem here in the way that contracts are conceived of, and in the way that contracting is sold inaccurately as a way to save money. But they're in kind of talking through some of these issues, talking with others who work on these issues. Stories came up like contracts that were given out to build schools, and then those schools end up being used by insurgents in order, basically as like bases. So that's one particular striking example. Other examples of facilities, infrastructure that was supposed to be built and was billed as if it was built, and then when an inspector went out to view the work, found that in fact it had been started but not finished, or in some cases not even started. So those are a couple of the examples that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. Someone is asking about the toilet seats and also who could be trusted to present Congress with the realities of the military budget. And, I would formulate that question, also by saying that there was an interesting article, I forget where, right before the elections, that was saying, the only sector of the economy that really could care less about who wins the election, whether it's Trump or Biden, is the military contracting companies, because they know that they're going to be doing really well, no matter who's president. And so the question then becomes, how could this situation possibly change? I mean, what could members of the public do to kind of push for this over-reliance to stop, and this stream of inflated funding to at least lessen a little bit? Like, what can we do?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And, thinking about the political issue and the involvement of Congress, what used to be called the military-industrial complex is now called the military-industrial congressional complex, because Congress is very much, for specific Congress people, it's, even if they're ideologically opposed to the growth of the military, when it comes to having contract dollars flow to their own district, they're less likely to fight against it. And so what we know, what the data show, is that there are military contract dollars in every single state and almost every single congressional district. And there's been some documentation of the intention of contractors to make sure this happens. So where you have a prime contractor getting a multi-billion-dollar contract and they need to subcontract that out, they intentionally subcontract to multiple different areas within the US to make sure those dollars are being distributed so that there is congressional support for that contractor and the work that they're doing in various congressional districts. And so this is a really difficult difficult political battle, because in some cases you have, the Department of Defense itself saying, we don't need this much money. And then Congress approves more than they actually need. So I was reading a report yesterday. It was a 2000 report looking at military installations throughout the US. And they found that there was about 20% excess capacity, and that when DoD was putting forth their budget, that they actually wanted less funding because of this recognition of the SS capacity, but that Congress gave them more than they actually needed. That there was pushback against the push to make their bases more efficient, essentially. And so it's not just about convincing Congress or having the right people convince Congress. It's I think the question would have to involve having fewer contract dollars in fewer places, so that there's some shot at gaining political momentum in the voting public, so that they would not continue to vote for people who are supporting military contract dollars in their area. But it's a difficult question.
Yeah, someone is asking about reduction in the defense budget in the 1990s led to a massive consolidation of the defense industry. If the government again reduces defense spending, will we see another wave of merger mania?
Yeah, that's a good observation, an accurate observation. Whether we would or wouldn't, I would think would have to do with antitrust laws and what would be permitted in consolidation or lack thereof. And so reduced spending wouldn't necessarily imply consolidation by more defense contractors. It could be paired with some decreased profit, what's allowable profit margins, for example, for firms like Lockheed Martin. So if Lockheed Martin's earning $4 to $8 billion a year in profit from government contracts, they could certainly take a smaller percentage of profit and survive without having to consolidate. And there are lots of firms in those cases, or in those situations. So I'm not sure that it would necessarily lead to consolidation, but I think it would. I think thinking through antitrust and kind of anti-monopolization would be an important aspect of reforming defense contracting.
Great. And someone else is asking about saying this exposition is excellent. How do you plan to get this information to the general public? YouTube is only one route. And if I may, I'll just answer that question a little bit in saying that the Cost of War Project does a ton of work behind the scenes to get our research into the hands of people who can make change. So we, as I said, Dr. Peltier's research was published in the Washington Post the day it was released, and many other publications as well picked up on it. We write op-eds and do interviews for the press. We hold briefings for members of Congress, and Dr. Peltier presented this research to the was it the Progressive Caucus recently, where you presented this information, and we have really ongoing active relationships with peace advocacy groups, and so we're always kind of figuring out ways to kind of put this research into the hands of people who are advocating for peace and demilitarization of the federal budget. So we do a lot of work to get this research out. That's kind of the mission of the Cost of War Project. I don't know if you have anything to add, Heidi.
No, I think you covered that well. Yeah, that the goal of the project really is to get this information. So it's not just to have an academic paper that academics talk about amongst themselves, but it's to get this message to our elected officials and out into the broader public in various ways. So yeah.
Do you know anything about there's been these many very, very public allegations of sexual abuse within the military. Do you know anything about contractors who've been subject to similar abuses?
I don't know. The only thing I could say, and this doesn't relate to that question precisely, but one of the questions that comes up with contracting is they're subject to different laws. Contractors are subject to different laws than troops are. And so that's been an issue when there's been cases of sexual assault overseas, not necessarily of the contractors of the troops, but by the contractors, or any other kinds of criminal violations that and any kinds of attacks by others, that contractors are not subject to the same laws as troops. And this is one of the difficult issues that there aren't good answers to.
So by not subject to the same laws, does that mean they're not subject to the same protections, or?
Yeah, so in some cases it's not subject to the same protection. So there was a good article that came out a couple months ago, and I'm forgetting where it was published now, but about basically torture and imprisonment of some contractors because they are more subject to the overseas laws than the laws of whatever country they're in serving,
like Afghanistan, or
like Afghanistan. And so there are fewer protections for the contractors.
Someone else is asking about subcontractors, and these kind of layers that you mentioned of contractors hiring subcontractors, hiring more subcontractors. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, so this is one of the ways it's really difficult to see where the money flows, and one of the ways that in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, money has gotten into the wrong hands, or money has just disappeared without knowing. That there have been estimates that the study in 2011 by the Commission on Wartime Contracting found that between 30 and 40% of spending on contractors was unaccounted for, or was lost to various things, including bribes and corruption and getting into the hands of insurgents. And so when you have, let's say, a large firm gets a prime contract from the DoD to establish, let's say, dining services in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then they contract out to subcontractors for food, for beverages, for utensils, for all of the things that go into providing services. And then those subcontractors might, a subcontractor providing food might then subcontract to another provider of a certain, food good. And so the dollars flowing out become harder and harder to track and to see who's actually providing the things that are getting back to the prime contractor who's earning the DoD dollars. A decent enough example to answer the question.
Yeah, great. So just quickly, someone is, I'm just going to talk about this question and then go to the last one because we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes. Someone's asking, where can one find statistics about which other countries are supplying contractors and perhaps types of contractors? And I will say that the paper by Noah Coburn on the Cost of War site it goes over, it tells the story of more about the kind of foreign national contractors and tells the stories of some Nepali contractors in the war zones. And then just I don't know if you have anything very quick to add to that, because someone else
I'll quickly add.
Someone else is very quick asking about again about possibilities for reform, reduction in contracting, and the oversight process. So perhaps we can end on that.
Okay, sure. So the Department of Defense puts out a census on contractors once a quarter. So you can look at the last one I found that was published was in July 2020. It was the CENTCOM, which is the Central Area of Command, CENTCOM. And that details a lot about the types of contractors, and it groups contractors, U.S. contractors, into, or I should say the war contracts into number of people who are Americans versus host country nationals versus third country nationals and the type of work that's being done there. So that gets published, and then the Congressional Research Service has a few different publications on contractor levels and types of contractor work. And then to the end, if that's the last question on reform, I think the first thing that has to happen is just reducing military spending overall, reducing war spending, and reducing the Pentagon's base budget. That's been steadily growing. I just was calculating yesterday, since 1970, defense spending has been increasing 4.9% a year on average. Since 2001, also about 5% a year. And that's regardless of whether we're at war or not at war, regardless of whether the troops are surging or not. On average, we're spending an additional 5% every year on the military. So the first thing is to reverse that trend by closing down some of the bases overseas, closing down some of the installations domestically, ending these endless wars, and so on. And then secondly is to reform contracting itself. So making contracting more competitive, getting rid of some of these clauses that allow contractors to have sole source, to be sole source suppliers for replacement parts, eliminating the lifetime service agreement so that the troops aren't as dependent on a contractor servicing a weapon system. So that's not just a question of where are the dollars going, but also the dependence of the troops on private firms or commercial firms. So eliminating lifetime service contracts, eliminating sole source supplier contracts, reforming contracting so that there is a lower amount of cost type contracting, so that the contractors actually have incentives to reduce costs. And then I would argue also putting some limitations on profit levels.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, this is Dr. Heidi Peltier, a research fellow at Boston University's Pardee Center, with a really excellent overview of the many costs of the military's over-reliance on military contractors. So thank you so much for taking the time today to explain the research. It was really illuminating. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. I hope you'll follow Costs of War. We have an email listserv. You can sign up on our homepage. It's www.costsofwar.org. So thank you very much once again.
Thanks, everyone.